Since the day of the accident, she never saw herself the same way again. It wasn't just her skin that changed. What changed was the reflection. What changed was the way she looked at herself. And most of all, how she stopped looking at herself. She avoided the mirror like someone avoids an old confrontation. The first rejection didn't come from others, or from the streets, or from the harsh words she would later hear. The first rejection came from herself. It happened when she faced her own image for the first time, with strangeness, with pity, with fear. She no longer recognized herself. That scar, etched on the left side of her face like a crack made of silence, seemed to scream everything she had never known how to say. And at the same time, it silenced everything she was before the pain. There are pains that mark us on the outside, but there are others older, deeper, that only find a way out when they are given a face, a shape, a line on the skin. The scar was new, but the shame was not. The fear of being compared, no. The feeling of abandonment, the desire to be loved without needing to deserve it, the anguish of feeling invisible even when she was present. All of that had lived inside her long before the accident. The scar only revealed what had always been there, waiting to be named. She began to believe her pain was in her skin. But in truth, her pain had always been in her soul. The cruelest part is that visible pain seems to justify the averted glances, the awkward silences, the conversations that stop when she enters. But no one sees the pain that came before. No one sees the pain of not having been chosen when she was still whole. No one sees the pain of having loved too much and still not being enough. The scar became an excuse for others to pull away, and for her to pull away from herself, as if now there were a concrete reason for what, deep down, had always been an old emotional wound: the fear of not deserving affection, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being seen and rejected. But, almost silently, life was preparing something she couldn't yet see, because the true new beginning doesn't start with the healing of the wound. It begins when someone, without trying to heal anything, simply sees, simply notices, without pity, without strangeness, without looking away. Someone who restores, with their simple and whole presence, the right to exist without having to hide. Someone who doesn't ask what happened, but asks, "What are you reading?" And it is in that kind of question, without urgency, without judgment, without the intention to fix, that the first breath of transformation is born. Because what is most personal, as Brené Brown said, is also what is most universal. Shame isolates us, but it also connects us. Connects us with everyone who has ever felt out of place, inadequate, invisible. Connects us with those who walk the streets with scars no one sees, but that hurt just the same. And it is at that point, at that exact point where personal pain meets collective pain, that the possibility of healing begins. Not the healing of the skin, but of the soul. Not the kind of healing that erases, but the one that integrates. The one that recognizes that there is beauty even in what broke us. Because there is a kind of beauty that doesn't depend on shape. It depends on truth. She didn't know it yet, but one day she would look at that scar and, for the first time, not see a mistake. She would see a crossing, and that would change everything. She noticed the cashier's hesitant glance, the slight recoil of a child at the park, the way conversations fell silent when she approached. But what hurt the most wasn't what happened in those moments. It was what those moments awakened inside her. The scar, still recent, only stirred up a much older story. The feeling of never having been truly accepted. As a child, she learned early that she had to behave, please, smile at the right time. Love, to her, was a currency of exchange. And every exchange demanded something in return. Beauty, kindness, silence. When the scar crossed her face, the equation that held her life together collapsed. She no longer had a way to pay for affection, and she began to believe that without that price, she would never be chosen. It wasn't just about the marked face. It was about what that face said without meaning to. With every step down the street, with every new attempt at conversation, she anticipated rejection. Because rejection already lived inside her, like an old voice that repeated, "Don't fool yourself, you are not enough." The body carries memories. And hers was full of moments when she had been left out without explanation. Childhood, where love was conditioned on obedience. Adolescence, where friendship depended on appearance. Relationships, always fragile. Always slipping away the moment she began to show who she truly was. All of this made the scar not something new, but a confirmation. Being avoided hurt, but more than that, it reopened invisible wounds. The fear of being judged, the shame of taking up space, the belief that something was fundamentally wrong with her. It's what psychologists call the wound of rejection, the kind that makes us expect abandonment even when no one has left us yet. The pain that makes us see refusal where there is only silence, and hostility where there is merely distraction. She walked around with that filter in her eyes, a filter made of past experiences and assumptions. And without realizing it, she began to live in a state of alert, always anticipating the moment the other person would pull away. The pain was as old as the desire to be loved without having to hide. But each new rejection, even if subtle, was a reminder that maybe this would never be possible. The scar wasn't just a mark. It was a mirror, and she began to live among reflections she didn't want to see, and memories she didn't know how to forget. The world seemed to confirm, every day, what she feared the most. That she was too much or not enough, never just right, never whole, and therefore unwanted. But there was something more, something that had not yet revealed itself clearly, but was already beginning to stir inside her. An intuition, a nearly forgotten memory that maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to keep molding herself to fit. That maybe, this time, love wouldn't come as a reward, but as recognition. And that being avoided wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new question. What if she could finally stop running from herself? She started being called by a new name, not by her own but by her mark. The one with the scar, the one who had the accident. And the worst part wasn't hearing it from others. It was accepting that new way of being recognized. Before long, she herself began to introduce herself that way, even if only in silence. It was as if all the other parts of her story had disappeared. Her favorite books, her quiet laugh, her ideas about the world, her most secret fears. All of it was overshadowed by the uneven line across her face. The pain, once an experience, now became identity. And deep down, that was a form of giving up. Taking on the wound as identity seemed, at first, like a way to protect herself. If she already saw herself as damaged, she wouldn't be surprised when the world treated her that way. It was a defense, but it was also a prison. She stopped telling her stories, stopped dreaming of other possibilities, stopped believing she could be seen in a different way. As if the scar had become her name, her role, her fate. Not because others said it, but because she began to believe it. There comes a moment when trauma stops being an event and becomes the filter through which everything is lived. She no longer knew who she had been before the pain. And that's dangerous, because when we forget who we were before the fall, we begin to believe that we fell because we deserved it. And nothing corrodes us more than this subtle, insidious idea that the pain wasn't an accident. It was a reflection of who we are. Carl Jung wrote, "What you resist, persists. What you accept, transforms." But she didn't know that yet. She was still trying to deny what she felt, pretending it didn't hurt, smiling when she wanted to cry, avoiding touch, the mirror, conversation. And in that effort to deny, she was submitting more and more to the narrative of pain. She was the scar. She was the accident. She was the woman no one looked in the eyes. There was no room for anything else. And then, something started to stir. A weariness, a quiet desire to step out of that role that felt safe but suffocating. A subtle discomfort, like a whisper from within. What if I'm still more than this? It was a timid question, still wrapped in fear. But it was the beginning of a crack. Because even when everything in us screams that the pain has defined us, there is a part, small, persistent, that still remembers who we are. Even if the voice is low, even if we pretend not to hear it, that part never disappears. And when pain becomes our name, it is that voice that slowly begins to tell a new story. She was sitting on a bench in a bookstore, blending into the background, flipping through a random book more to pass the time than out of real interest. The city outside carried on with its usual rhythm, but inside there was a silence that embraced her. She wasn't expecting anything. She had already given up on pleasant surprises. She had grown used to the feeling of being avoided, of making people uncomfortable. Then a woman approached, sat beside her, didn't look away, didn't show pity. She simply stayed, present, just present. The conversation emerged timidly, as things do when there are no expectations. A comment about the book in her hands, a shared impression of the cover, and before she realized it, she was talking. Not about herself, not yet, but about the plot, the characters. And the woman listened, not hurriedly, not with forced curiosity. She listened like someone who knows that the most important thing isn't what's being said, but what is being felt between the lines. In that presence, there was a kind of tenderness that doesn't announce itself. It was a presence that didn't demand explanations, that didn't ask what had happened to her face, that wasn't uncomfortable with the silence between sentences. It was a kind of listening that welcomed even what hadn't yet been said. And there, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a mistake. She felt like a whole person, even if still in pieces. The gesture was small, a brief encounter, maybe forgotten by the other woman the next day. But in her, it left new marks, gentle marks. She began to wonder, what if I'm still capable of having a conversation? What if someone out there can still see me beyond the scar? Not like before, not as if nothing had happened, but as someone who carries pain and, still, deserves kindness, deserves continuity. Science might say it was a release of oxytocin, that the brain responded to human connection with relief. But what she felt was something else. It was a quiet reconfiguration of her own story, as if, for an instant, she could see herself through that woman's eyes. And what she saw wasn't rejection, nor fear. She saw possibility. She saw a thread of hope gently stitching the edges of a wound she had already accepted as eternal. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't redemption. It was something subtler, rarer. It was someone seeing her existence with naturalness. And for someone who had spent so long hiding, that was worth more than any cure. Because it's in these simple, unexpected encounters that the soul begins to remember who it is, and little by little begins to come home. She began to look at the mirror differently. Not every day, not easily, but with a certain new care. She no longer avoided her reflection as much. There was still pain, there was still fear, but something inside her was beginning to change. And that change didn't come because the scar had disappeared. It wasn't because she learned to like it. It was because, for the first time, she didn't see herself as reduced to it. She realized the mark on her face wasn't the end of her story. It was just a chapter, and perhaps not even the most important one. There wasn't a single moment of revelation. It was a process made of small gestures. A lipstick kept for years that she dared to wear again. A forgotten earring that once more adorned her ear. A smile, shy, awkward, but one that appeared more often. She began to see herself as whole, even with cracks. And she understood, with a clarity that needed no words, that beauty is not the absence of marks. Beauty is the courage to keep being who you are, even after being broken. Someone, that woman from the bookstore perhaps, had seen more than her skin, saw her intelligence, saw her attentive gaze, saw her quiet sweetness, and that external, truthful, non-judging gaze helped reopen an internal gaze. She began to remember things she had once forgotten. How much she liked writing by hand, how happy old music made her, how her presence used to soothe children. The scar was still there, but she was no longer just the marked woman. She was the woman who wrote, who sang, who welcomed. The day she took the mirror from the dark corner of the bedroom and hung it on the living room wall was symbolic. Not out of vanity, but as a ritual, as a way of saying, I've come back to myself, not to deny what happened, but to integrate, because true acceptance is not resignation. It is recognition. It is saying, this happened to me, but it doesn't define me. This is part of my story, but it's not my whole story. By accepting the scar as part of the narrative, she freed herself from the burden of hiding, of explaining, of justifying. She discovered she didn't need to be loved in spite of the scar. She could be loved with it, with everything it symbolized, with everything it had taught her, with everything that would still be part of her journey. And that brought lightness, a lightness that didn't come from forgetting the pain, but from looking at it and saying, "You transformed me, but you didn't destroy me." And perhaps for the first time, that was enough. That was beautiful. That was peace. After that encounter in the bookstore, after the days when she began to see herself with less harshness, something inside her expanded, as if the gaze she had received had lit a light that now projected outward. She began to notice gestures that once escaped her. The silence of a neighbor always in a rush, the tense smile of the girl at the bakery, the tired look of the bus driver. There were scars everywhere, not all visible but all present. And now, for the first time, she could see them. The pain that had once isolated her now built bridges. Where there had been fear, empathy appeared. Where there had been judgment, compassion was born. Not a paternalistic compassion, but the kind that understands because it has hurt before. The kind that doesn't need explanations to offer comfort. And this also changed the way she existed in the world. She began to smile more, not because everything was fine, but because she understood how a smile could be a shelter. She began to listen more, because she knew the value of being listened to without hurry. This new way of seeing didn't come from ready-made formulas or motivational quotes. It came from the experience of having been seen when she felt most invisible. And above all, from allowing herself to see herself without hatred, without shame. That also healed the way she related to others. She realized that many of the distances she had felt before didn't come only from others, but from the expectation of rejection she carried like armor. And as she opened up, as she looked at others with less fear, others began to look back. The transformation was quiet, but deep. She began working with people who had experienced trauma, not because she wanted to save anyone, but because she knew what it meant to need a safe place. She knew what it was like to carry marks no one else could understand. And that knowing didn't come from books. It came from skin, from soul, from memory. It was a way to give back what she had received. A gaze that doesn't condemn, a listening that doesn't demand, a presence that stays. When you heal your pain, you also heal the way you relate to the world. She understood that phrase not as a theory, but as a lived truth. And so, little by little, she became a bridge. Where once there were walls, now there was passage. Where once there was fear, now there was a path. And on that path, she was no longer alone. Because now, at last, she was also a shelter, for others and for herself. She spent years trying to hide. She chose clothes that covered more, always positioned herself on the opposite side in photos, avoided gatherings where direct light was present. She didn't want anyone to see her scar. She didn't want anyone to know what had happened. But more than that, she didn't want that to be everything about her. And, ironically, by trying to silence that part of her story, she was the one who gave it more power. Because what we hide grows, what we deny gains weight. And it was only when she stopped fighting it that she began to feel lightness. Now she understands. She understands that those who truly see her, see beyond. That those who stay aren't staying because they ignore her mark. They stay because they include it without letting it reduce everything else. The scar, which for so long was pain, is now a crossing. A reminder of what she faced, what she overcame, what she still carries, but no longer with despair. With dignity, with respect, with love. Because there is beauty in surviving. There is beauty in continuing. There is beauty in not having erased the signs of the fall, but in having turned them into a map. Clarissa Pinkola Estes wrote, "Women who run with the wolves know, the marks of the past are not wounds, they are maps of where we've been." And now, she carries this map with quiet pride. She doesn't need to show it to everyone, but she also doesn't hide it. It's part of her. And more than that, it guides her. Because the scar wasn't just the consequence of what she suffered. It was also the seed of what she became. The pain didn't disappear, but it was reorganized. It no longer dominates her days. It no longer dictates her choices. She hasn't forgotten what she felt. She's just learned how to care for what she feels. And that is more than overcoming. That is healing. It is a reconnection with who she has always been, before the pain, before the fall, before the running. She is not a marked woman. She is a whole woman. Whole because she went through fragmentation. Whole because she came back. Because she chose to return. Because she knew how to wait for herself. And now, when she looks in the mirror, she no longer searches for flaws. She searches for presence. She searches for truth. And she recognizes herself. Not like before, but in a new way, deeper, truer. Because there is a silent strength in someone who didn't erase the scars, but learned to walk with them. Like someone who finally understood that the pain was a path. And that the crossing continues. Time passed, and with it, the intensity of the pain transformed. It didn't disappear, but it settled like earth after a storm. Now, when she walks through the same streets where she once felt invisible, something has changed. Not in the way others look at her. Those looks remain varied, unpredictable, but in the way she receives them. She no longer fears being seen. She no longer shrinks back. She no longer apologizes for taking up space. She is there, whole, and that is new. There is a serenity in her presence that only those who have reached rock bottom know. A way of being that doesn't demand attention but draws it in. Because there is something profoundly beautiful in someone who no longer needs to prove anything. In someone who has learned, through every rejection, to welcome herself with more tenderness. In someone who has learned to listen to her own story with patience, until the narrative of pain could be stitched together with threads of love. She still faces challenges. She still feels fear, still hesitates. But now there are resources within her. There are memories of days when she was seen with love. There is silent evidence that healing is not a fantasy. She carries the marks of her struggle on her body, but carries in her soul the memory of her resilience. And that sustains her. Sometimes, when she sees someone with averted eyes, with shoulders bent under the weight of an unspoken pain, she approaches slowly, not to ask, not to comfort, just to be, because she has learned that presence can be more healing than any words. And in simply being there, without haste, without demand, she becomes a shelter. Just like one day someone was a shelter for her. The scar wasn't erased, but it was crossed. It was understood. And now, instead of a prison, it is a portal. Portal to a more real life, more sensitive, more human. And perhaps that is true healing. Not returning to who she was before the pain, but finally becoming who she was always meant to be. Without hiding, without fear, without asking permission to exist. Just being. Whole. In peace. Present. There is no closing music. No final applause. There is only life as it is. Made of simple mornings, of deep silences, of quiet reunions with one's own soul. She didn't become someone else. She didn't turn into an example, nor an inspirational story displayed in someone else's window. She simply kept going. And for someone who once thought of giving up, continuing is a sacred act. Some people still look at her with strangeness, others with tenderness. But what matters most is that now she looks at herself with humanity, with the care of someone who has learned, through hardship, not to abandon herself. Self-love didn't come like lightning, nor as an epiphany. Came as ritual, as a repeated gesture, as a quiet choice. Came when she forgave herself, not for having been hurt, but for having believed for so long that she didn't deserve to be whole. The scar is now a starting point, a line that separates the before and the after, the time when she hid from the world, and the time when she began to return. There are still days when she cries. There are days when she withdraws. But there are also days when she laughs lightly, as if the pain had never been so deep. And maybe that is the greatest achievement. Not erasing the past, but living with it without guilt, without shame, without fear. She no longer needs to be understood by everyone. No longer needs to prove her worth. The dignity she found is quiet, but immense. It is the dignity of someone who knows that, even marked, she is capable of loving and being loved. Of someone who knows that, even after being avoided, she carries within herself a world that deserves to be seen. This is not a story with a happy ending. It's a story of continuation, of healing in progress, of exposed humanity, with its cracks, its affections, its lessons, and, above all, with the beauty of someone who chose not to disappear, because there is an invisible strength in those who have survived their own abandonment, and that strength now walks with her, without hurry, without fanfare, only with truth, and with the peace of someone who, one day, understood. The scar remained, but the pain no longer rules.